Education at the University of Delhi, along with a major part of his doctoral work at the University of Texas, USA. There, he spent 1 year as a Fulbright scholar. His areas of interest for research are very eclectic. At various points of time, he has delved into issues related to textual criticism and visual media, as well as histories of Sufism, language, regions, and of domestic servants. His most prominent books are A Political History of Literature in 15th Century and his co-edited volume, Servants Past, which is a study of the past of domestic servants in South Asia. Dr. Jha works with the literary sources of medieval North India, primarily those in Sanskrit, Persian, Urdu, Maithili, Bengali, and Upper Brahmi languages. At present, Dr. Jha teaches history of early modern India and of Europe at LSR College in Delhi. He is also the managing director of the journal Indian Economic and Social History Review, along with numerous contributions for local, national, international journals in English as well as Hindi. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you so much. Is this on?
Yeah. Pardon the one.
Now I think it's on. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to this college. I have spent some early formative years here as a teacher, not as a student, where I failed the interview. क्योंकि मुझे इंग्लिश नहीं आती थी, अभी थोड़ी आ गई है, तो but I must also give a couple of disclaimers before I start. One of these is that this is a work that remains incomplete, the one that I'm going to talk about, and hence I'm always going to be a little more tentative than one is permitted. Talks like these. The other disclaimer is that this is, it's not always that I try to repeat. This time I tried to do this because I thought one should catch up with the changing faces of technology. So मैंने कोशिश किया है. I'm not sure if I will be, what I speak will be in line with what you will see on the PPT. So randomly I'll keep sort of, keep the slides moving, or I will need someone's help if you can do that. So as the topic, cultures of servitude in North Indian history, suggests, it's a suitably vague topic to suit an area that should have been that should have been researched, worked over, but hasn't been actually. And there are reasons for it. So I'm going to talk first about servants, servitude, cultures of servitude, then locate it in terms of sources, information, kahan se aa rahi hai. Does everyone understand Hindi here? Is there anyone who doesn't understand Hindi? सबको अंग्रेजी समझ में आती है? हाँ? Everyone understands English? Okay, so I can be bilingual. Alright. So, cultures of servitude. There is a reason why I want to be bilingual, apart from the obvious, which is that I'm going to shift between languages in order to underline the difficulties of researching this category called servant, even defining this category. So for example, when I talk to my students, many of them want to become civil servants. And so servant sounds service and servitude. These are two words which are cognate with servant, but they carry very different connotations. One appears to be much more honorable than the other. The other one appears to underline some sort of
civil service and domestic service.
Sorry?
Civil service and domestic service.
Domestic service and civil service. Also, the idea of seva, So Pradhan Sevak instead of Pradhan Mantri, where even the slight cultural capital, the emotional capital of victimhood is taken away from the actually working people. When Jawaharlal Nehru for the first time declared that he was not going to work as Prime Minister but Pradhan Mantri but as Pradhan Sevak. बाद में वो ideas और भी चले गए, but we'll come to that. The important thing is that the historiographic traditions in India have refused to take note of, even in recent times, refused to take note of a very, very basic paradox, which is that on the one hand you have a ubiquitous visibility of servants, domestic servants in particular, if one uses the word domestic servants slightly flexibly. सब जगह है, maid servant, domestic servant. On the other hand, the one place where you don't find domestic servants as a category is in history. In history books, you come across labor, you come across gender labor, you come across histories of caste, you come across work, but you don't come across domestic servants or domestic servitude. And the reason for this absence, this apparent paradox, is even more astounding perhaps, that's how it appears to me, than the absence itself. So, one reason why we don't find domestic servants in histories, even the progressive histories, the left-wing histories of work for a long time, until very recently, is because of the way in which work was defined in the Marxian tradition, where work was understood as productive, non-household work, factory work, where productivity itself was defined in a very limiting fashion. But that's the traditional labor history issue. Okay? In recent times, labor history has kind of expanded and moved into different arenas and looked beyond the fact that there can be work in the beyond the fact that there used to be work, productive work only in the factory. So now they have started looking at, especially in the last 25, 30 years, they've started researching the history of unorganized sectors as well in recent times, gig work and so on. But the idea of work itself, the idea of labor itself, understood with reference to productivity and value addition, understood again in Marxist terms. Those of us who studied in the 90s, 80s, 90s as undergrad students were given these 3 volumes of Theory of Surplus Value by Marx to read, where we understood the specific character of work, of labor, of surplus appropriation and so on. So that was the paradigm within which labor was understood. Putting aside domestic service. Now, I have a personal trauma associated with it. As a child, I remember, like most of us, I remember having grown up with a maid servant at home. When I was in class 10, I saw her begging. She left work. I was told that she had grown old, she could not work anymore. And after 2 years, I saw her begging somewhere. She saw me as well, and she tried to run away because she felt ashamed. And that left a trauma on me. And I tried to find out what happens to when I started doing history honors. I tried to find out what happens to old age maid servants, obviously because they don't have any kind of social security protection, and till date there is no social security protection for domestic workers. There is not even a minimum wages regulation for domestic workers. The first attempt at minimum wages was made in the 1770s, but even now we don't have such a regulation. At different points of time, there have been debates about it. You can read about it in in our co-edited volume, which is called Servants' Pasts, and I'm not going to repeat those debates. But the point is that we have not been able to regulate this sector, even in terms of providing the bare minimum protection of minimum wages. But I'm going to today focus on a period that I'm more familiar with, which is to look at the prehistory of domestic servitude. Can you move on? Let me see what is there. Can I see that here, so that I will know what you guys are looking at? So this is something that I have talked about. Now, this is a quotation with which I would like to start. I came across this and took a picture. I came across this in Sanskrit University in South Delhi, just beside the ISI. ISI is really statistical institute. If the judiciary can confuse between the two, we can be excused for confusing. So, as you can see, this actually is very telling because of the fact that it talks about servants as a problem. Okay? And I was struck because a day before I visited this university, I had met a friend who was trying to purchase a house in Greater Noida. And when I asked her whether she liked the property that she saw, she told me that the property was good. But when she talked to the people in the neighborhood, they told her कि यहाँ domestic servants नहीं मिलता है, क्योंकि यहाँ slums नहीं है आसपास, तो domestic servant नहीं मिलता है. Now, the reason why I wanted you to see this quote is because this is from, although it says Kirat, I don't know why it says Kirat. Kirat is a community, is a Pahari community, a forest dwellers community mentioned in various ancient Sanskrit texts, especially Mahabharata, Ramayana, and even as late as 16th, 17th century grammatical Ramayanas. But this quote probably comes from the Shanti Parv of Mahabharata, which says Navanchaniya Prabhu Anujividhi. That is to say, those who are dependent, although the translation here is slightly imprecise, it's not servant, but Anujividhi literally refers to those who are dependent for their livelihood on someone else. Okay? Anujividhi. So, as you can see, the understanding the lexical framing of servants was primarily in terms of those who were dependent for livelihood. Okay? This is interesting because even in the colonial times, when people were trying to frame regulations for domestic service, the stimulus for that debate actually came. The stimulus for that debate actually came from this idea of servant problem, that there is a problem at hand. Okay? Why? Because servants' activities were difficult to regulate. Recently ILO tried to estimate how many servants, domestic servants are there in India, and the estimate varies unbelievably between 2.5 million and 90 million, depending on how you define the category of domestic servant. And why is it so difficult to define the category of domestic servant? Because of the fact that in this frame, domestic servant, the word domestic as well as servant are actually very expensive or could be very, very narrow terms. So, when we try to sort of figure out exactly what is domestic and what is not, you can think of domestic servants as people who work in the household. There will be people who stay in the household, and there can be people who stay somewhere else and come to the household to work. That is, people who are referred to as part-time workers. The important thing is that sometimes attendants, like in the Middle Ages, they referred to the personal attendants as the khidmatgar or the khawas, from which the word khas comes. In many North Indian cultures, when a barat leaves, the bridegroom is supposed to move with a personal attendant, a khawas. Okay? And interestingly, nowadays the personal attendant is, like the barat itself, is symbolic in the sense that, I'm sure all of you are aware that the idea of barat itself comes from this medieval Rajput tradition of attacking the bride's family and seizing the bride by force. That is the idea. That's why all traditional barats actually move only with a male retinue. So similarly, the khawas, the personal attendant, was supposed to be there with the groom. But the interesting thing is that wherever the Swami, the Lord, moves, the khawas, the personal attendant, will move. And the space of the domestic, in a way, becomes the mobile space, the portable space. So he remains the domestic servant, but he is moving as well. The other word in Sanskrit, in fact the most common word in Sanskrit for domestic servant is bhritya. Bhritya. Now literally the word bhritya also comes from the Hebrew, which means to nurture, to provide livelihood. जहाँ से हिंदी का शब्द आता है भरण पोषण. So bhritya is someone who is supported, like Anuji Miri. Bhritya is someone who is supported. So the definition of this category is not in terms of the service that is provided, but in terms of the fact that the person is dependent. I mean, that is how the ancient texts are trying to define it. So the reason why I'm talking in terms of the vocabulary that we use for domestic servants is because of the fact that historiographically it is the information about domestic servants is actually all over. It's not to be found in any one place. So the location, the language, the genres, the categories, and they are embedded in various contexts. Most importantly, they are embedded within context of caste, something that historians are not easy to work with. So, as you can see, there are various issues that I have flagged here in trying to understand the historiography, trying to approach a credible framework for writing a history of the domestic servants. So, for example, take the category of household or family. The most common word for family in Sanskrit is kutum. That's the word that you often come across. I'm sure all of you have heard of this very often repeated phrase, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, right? Ayam nicham karovyati karanadam udar chartanam tu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is to say that those who are open-minded, liberal-minded, udar chartanam, for them the whole world is like a family. Now this is a kind of mouth-wateringly capacious kind of, or sounds like an assertion that is mouth-wateringly accommodating, until you try to understand the definition of the word kutum. So quite clearly, if you look at the earliest and as late as 17th century texts in Sanskrit, and there are copious references to Kutub. That is one category which you will find defined in Dharma Shastras, in storybooks, in collections, in all kinds of literary genres. You will come across the definition of Kutub, and it remains more or less stable, even though there is no single definition. But broadly, the idea of a Kutub has never been restricted to the idea of what we today know as the unit family. So the Kutub typically includes not just the blood relations and the marital relations, it also includes those who have been adopted and those who are service providers, that is servants. Okay? And servants here often are explained in terms of those who provided service within the household as well as those who provided service outside the household. So the word that is often used is those who work in the cow pen and those who work outside the cow pen. Okay? And often the specific workload of an individual domestic servant would not specify. That is, you could be employed within the cow pen and outside the cow pen. That is the idea. Now, interestingly, one of the texts out of about 50 texts that were composed between the 14th and the 17th century to regulate the conduct of the Shudras. Okay? So there is this, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the word Shudra as a Varna category. But the word Shudra was often used in various other contexts, not just to refer to the Varnas, but also in various other contexts. For example, Shudras as people who worked, okay, who worked with their own hands. So the context makes it clear that it refers to people who are working with their own hands. Okay? And very often their work is considered to be in the context of the unproductive work. That is to say, as helpers. So just as, for example, today in the age of sanitizing all the vocabularies, we often tend to refer to the domestic servant not as Naukarani but as help. Okay? So use of an English register also helps us sort of distance ourselves from these more intimate kind of relations. But as most of us are aware, even the word help actually is hugely problematic in the sense that it's not just help, it's work. Bengalis use the word kaje wali, or in North India, the less sophisticated would use the word gaam wali, okay? Which I think is a much more neutral, work-specific term. But we'll come to that. The important thing here is the fact that the around 49 texts that one historian has indexed, composed in Sanskrit to regulate the conduct of Shudras between the period 14th to 17th century. All of them, almost all of them, I have not studied all of them, I have looked at only two. Shudrachar Shiromani and Shudra Nigam. But there are others who have looked at this corpus and they assert that almost all of them define the Kutub inclusive of the Shudra welfare. And it goes to the extent of saying that the Grihast, that is the Grihaswami, must hold proper rituals after the Shudra welfare passes away for his salvation as well as the Shudra's salvation. Now it is interesting to keep in mind that the word Kutum here refers to the family of only the Grihast, not the family of Shudra, who also has a wife and children at home. Right? So, interestingly, this kind of exclusive definition of kutum makes kutum not only a space that is the primary space for exclusion, it also is an extremely hierarchized space, because the Shudra is defined also in terms of his mobility or her mobility. What parts of the domestic space he or she can visit, and what are her or his entitlements, and what are the places that they cannot visit. So obviously the kutum here is both an exclusive category as well as a thoroughly hierarchized category. And that is why I sort of sometimes worry about making this whole world into a kutum, which it already appears to be turned into. So now another important variable which makes it difficult for the traditional categories of writing histories of labor, somewhat useless in the context of domestic service, is the variable of affect, the emotional angle, as it were. So most of us, I mentioned to you that I had this personal trauma of seeing my childhood maid second dead. Why? Most of us, when we interact with a worker, whether as an employer or as a consumer, there is absolutely no relation of affect. At least that is not how it is meant to be. Whereas we often hear of a servant जो बेटी की जैसी है, a servant जो बेटे के जैसा है, a didi, and so on. So there are relations of affect embedded within ideas of a caste mentality, as well as ideas of a very gendered workspace, where the domestic servant is trapped in a relation where it is difficult to distinguish exploitation from an affective relation. Okay? So it becomes kind of a weaponization. If I were to sort of go to the extreme, I would say a weaponization of emotions, as well as a space which might often also be used by the domestic servant for negotiation and for resistance. Okay, so I haven't yet talked about resistance. These are some of the terminologies that you come across. Again, in our book, we have made a table of a large number of words for servants, and those of you who are interested in details might take a look at that. I have here some of the terms mentioned. I want to talk in particular about 2-3 words here which are more common and which have had a kind of interesting trajectory of conceptual shifts. So the word knocker, for example, is a Mongolian origin word which evolved, which we find in Persian sources from roughly about 13th century onwards, late 12th century onwards, and which referred to paid work, but employment which was beyond relations of slavery or affect. Okay? So when individuals were employed for specific tasks and given particular remuneration, even though those relations of task performance were not contractual relations, so there was no written contract. The other word which we today use almost kind of interchangeably now is the word chakra, which has a different kind of origin. I have not been able to trace its roots, and as it happens in the world of languages, when we are unable to trace the roots of word, then you blame it on an indigenous variety. So generally it is assumed that the word chakar must be one of those desaj words, as we say in the grammar. So the word chakar comes perhaps for the first time to the best of my knowledge in a late 13th, early 14th century text called Varna Ratnakar from Bihar. That is where we come across this word, but I would not be surprised if some of the earlier Prakrit texts mention this. The third term that I want to refer to in this context is the word banda. Now, literally, the word banda refers to a slave, as most of us know. However, the word banda, das, over a period of time, like the Sanskrit term das, also comes to signify some kind of an honorable and willful submission to a greater power. So, just as for example, as you know, Kabir Das, Tulsi Das, all of these people refer to themselves as Das in a paradoxical lexical move where you declare your willful subjection for the sake of larger emancipation. So, where incarceration becomes the condition of emancipation. For Meera, for example, to cut herself off from her subjection in the real world, she declares herself to be the slave of the banda of the Lord. So, similarly, the word banda had such a trajectory like das. Interestingly, however, the idea of naukri and bandagi came to intersect with each other by the 14th, 15th century, where bandagi, as in willful submission, almost bordering on ibadat, that is worship of the Lord, bandagi becomes the parameter, the primary perfection of, as it were, loyalty. Okay? So, all of these, naukri and bandagi, we hear of more frequently from 13th century onwards in the context of Delhi Sultanate, where we notice that service provision within the context of skill is now breaking away from earlier kinship-based trajectories to now a more contract, more cultivated loyalty-based service trajectory. So it's useful to keep in mind that bandagi becomes the kind of gold standard for test of loyalty, and that is why when Akbar started this much misunderstood order of Ilahi, actually, a part of the rituals that he conducted for those who agreed to join the order was to agree to be his chela. Now, chela, another word that comes from probably has a desaj root, comes from probably the Prakrit tradition. Again, refers to the same idea of total submission. So, now, it is interesting that these traditions were ultimately in the Indian context embedded within practices of jati and varna, what we today refer more commonly as caste. A Brahman's name was to sound auspicious, Mangalyam. The Kshatriyas valiant, Parakrami. The Vaishyas wealthy. And the Shudras must express strength. That is, I think this is Oliver's translation. I would translate Jugupsa as repulsa. Okay, so it should repel the need of a Shudra. A ruler should strive to make the Shudra poor. Nirdhanam Kritva. Now, please understand that these are not the only references to Shudras, and these are not the only context in which Manav Dharmshastra, which is a huge text, should be understood. The reason why I have quoted them here is because I want you to appreciate the fact that naming, which is central to the identity of modern categories of substance today, most of the people would be, named in the colonial and modern post-independence period as per some deformity or color of their skin, or some funny feature in their body, or simply by the generic name of Ram, irrespective of their caste background. So, there are actually references in the Katha Sarit Sagar to stories which are, which we may talk about if you have questions regarding that. But I want to relate to you one story that many of you might already be familiar with, which is the story of King Vichitra Virya in Mahabharata, who was unable to produce a male Sion, and eventually his queens, Ambika and Ambalika, were visited by sage Vyas. And I'm sure you will be aware that Ambika closed her eyes with shame, and Ambalika went pale with shame. And as a result, the children who were produced became Dhritarashtra, the blind, and Pandu was born with a jaundice and remained pale all his life. And for that reason, perhaps not fully fit to be kings, though they did become kings. But eventually, when the queen requested Sage Vyas to make a third visit to Ambika, in the hope that she will not close her eyes, Ambika, who didn't want to go through this again, requested one of the dasis to go in her place. And the person who was born, obviously the dasi didn't feel ashamed, that's the assumption. And the person who was born was the most sagacious villain, who is represented in all of Mahabharata as the most intelligent, the most sagacious, a man of wisdom next only to Krishna. So, what does this story tell us about the dasi, about the freedoms available to her, about what she was entitled to and what she was not, and so on? One can only try to guess. So, when we think about moments of resistance in the history of domestic servants, there are many but stray examples from stories, especially the colonial narratives are very interesting. But there are interesting stories in the Panchatantra, in the Katha Sarit Sagar. I want to tell you one story from a collection of folk tales by Komal Kothari, from Komal Kothari by Mr. Marucha, where a Punya peasant, Punya is a caste category in Rajasthan, a lower caste category, and also the name of this person who seems to have narrated the story. So there is this Punya peasant who is seen as the first peasant to have indulged in agriculture. And his story is narrated that when this was the time for harvest, sun and moon came and said that we have contributed to your harvest, so we will take half the share. And the crop that was there was maize, which grows in the middle of the crop. So Punya told them to take the upper half of the plant, and the moon and sun went away with the upper half of the plant without realizing that they got nothing. Next year, Punia planted something else. This time, he planted marjan, which grows on top. And this time also he had a very good crop. But the sun and the moon decided to clean the lower half of the earth and fool again, because they had no idea of agricultural work. And this, after narrating this story, the narrator asks the audience, so who do you think moon and sun are? And everyone shouts Chandravanshis and Suryavanshis. So there is a clear kind of line of subversion that you can see this story taking along past lines. Very similar, very interesting stories are there. Some of it, if you like, I can narrate. If you have questions from there. What I want to underline here is the fact that the earliest references to domestic service in the Sanskrit texts and in some of the vernacular texts before 14th century all appear to be of generic nature. They refer to servants, they refer to Bhritya, Chetty, that's another word, and they refer to the idea that they should be kept in good humor, but never sort of given more than their due, because they can easily get spoiled, and so on. So there are various contexts in which there are stories which are moralizing stories, instructive stories. But from 14th century onwards, especially 15th century onwards, you see a huge variety across linguistic and generic conventions. You see a huge variety of codes of conduct. So even as late as 19th century, you will find codes of conduct for servants, for knocker. Similarly, if you read the stories, like I have read some of the Hindi stories around the figure of servant, and there are many by almost all of the major Hindi story writers have at least one or two stories around the figure of servant. Some have major stories around. So in almost all of them, there are these codes for the servants. From 19th century onwards, it's interesting that these codes are very similar to the codes for wives. Okay? And there is substantive amount of work that will show you something that some of us know very instinctively, which is the similarity of the two profiles, both lexical as well as social. So I remember, for example, when I started work, and I was teaching in this college at that time, and like it happens at a young age when you start earning. I was living with two other friends and a servant. And relatives who visited me would often say, "Kab tak nauker ke saath rahoge, ab shaadi karna." Now, just because all of us have heard this so many times, sometimes we may not realize the enormous implications of what is being said. Okay? The overlaps between these categories of wife and domestic serving has been something that historians have worked upon, told, anthropologists have reported on this, ethnographics have talked about it, and interestingly, 19th century literary not actually is witness to the fact that there is considerable overlap. Typically, like it always happens when I'm talking about servitude, I'm all over. So I will stop here, and I'll hope that some coherence to the narrative emerges in the question and answer session. And I hope that you have. Thank you.
Dutch scholar who worked on knockers and
किसका?
Dutch scholar. It is work on the knockers.
अच्छा नौकर से point अच्छा
He was one of the earliest guys.
yeah but he actually doesn't talk about nौकर in that
Yeah,
sense for him the category of peasant actually is pretty omnipresent and he doesn't really talk about that.
So the concept of knocker is particular 19, I think, not earlier.
Any questions?
Hi sir. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. This is actually for the greater benefit of the students here. I was also a student and lover of the late lamented Sunil Kumar, and I was hoping if you could just expand on Bandari and Naukri and the transition that he maps out from, say, the 13th to the 15th century, and how there's this incredible way in which the concept of Bandari moves away from actual slavery, but the let's say the standards of loyalty and devotion that then become markers for service, as you mentioned. And so those who may not be aware of it to that extent in the room would get to know more about it.
See, I mean, ये तो सुनील कुमार का काम है. So basically, what he suggests is that the early Delhi Sultanate was based on the idea of elite slavery from the Gulams. And among the Gulams, the Banda, the Khas, as it were, loyalty was infused through a process of nurture and through a process of training, tarbiyat and parvarish. However, over a period of time, the institution of slavery declined and Naukri emerged in its place, even though it continued to employ the category of bandagi as the gold standard of loyalty. So the idea was that the Naukar would be like a banda, and his loyalty would be above as much as that of a banda. Part of the fact that the banda's loyalty itself was always and never taken for granted. Okay, so the banda's loyalty had to be cultivated, just as the loyalty of the Naukar also had to be cultivated. So the idea of Naukari as honorable, and so honorable today that unfortunately so many of our students want to become Naukari. So long as it is Sarkari Naukari, right? And they are also referring to Sarkari Naukari. So the idea of the servant, the idea of Naukari being honorable is central to the entire machinery of the state, working with the help of dependable servants who are not related and have no stakes in the monarchical government in terms of their personal, their emotional ties, and yet are honorably linked to the state and work. So that was the shift that he talked about between the 13th and the 16th centuries.
My question is basically when Professor Chalgupta is writing upon servants specifically to do with the early 20th century, she is mentioning cases wherein Muslim servants are to be kept away from Hindu households, right? And how do you look at Muslim servants working in Hindu households or Hindu servants working in Muslim households in the pre-colonial period? And the other question that I had was, I think his name is Nitin Sinha, who seems to work on, who wrote an essay basically dividing between who a knocker is and who a chakra is. And in which you also elucidated that a knocker generally is somebody who is functioning beyond the realms of affection generally does not work on a knocker. But I mean, how Sinha categorizes the knocker, the munshi parts of form of the category of the knocker, right? In cinema, we see a large number of, the munshi emerging as a figure who is extremely, close to the family. So I would like to know how does that then, lie within your definition of knocker, who is lying beyond the realm of emotion. Thank you.
See, Charugupta's work on Hindu and Muslim servants, household distinctions that are made. I think in the pre-colonial times, for the Mughal period, you would come across households which maintain a distinction, ritual distinction, but are not sort of maintaining a separation. Meaning, for example, that you will find servants who are non-Muslims employed in Muslim households. Similarly, in the Rajput concubinage, you will come across queens who are Muslims. Okay, that is not queens, concubines who are Muslims. So, the distancing is not there, separation is not there. But the ritual distinctions are there in the sense that, for example, if there is a Hindu lady or concubine in the Muslim palace, then facilities will be provided to her for her observance of religious rituals, which are separate from the Islam. Such references are there from the Mughal period. Now, as for the other distinction between knocker and chakar, Nitin Sinha's work is actually in the context of Calcutta archives. So he's talking about Bengal. Right? If you're talking about, he may say that he's separately published, because he is also the co-author of the book with me. So Nitin and I co-edited a volume and co-wrote, actually co-edited 2 volumes and co-wrote 2 introductions as well. But the work that you're referring to is one that he's done alone, which is based on Calcutta archives. And in the context of Bengali language, the word chako actually refers to someone who's embedded within the family. Unlike the word knocker, which he comes across in the archives, the colonial archives as well. So these 2 categories are very distinct within the context of late 18th century and early 19th century, which is the period that is dealing. Right? The Munshi, on the other hand, has had a far more colorful and I would say divergent trajectory. So, for example, if you see 17th century, early 17th century, the best example of Munshi would be someone like Chandraman, who was the scribe in Shah Jahan's and Muhammad's court. And Chandraman Brahman is this high-flying man who is next to no one in the history. He's a scholar or person, but he's not embedded in the family. He's a bureaucrat. He's distant. He has his own palace and his own family. On the other hand, the Munshi category that you see in the movies, which is more of a caricature of Munshi, because Munshis were, remember, very, very powerful people in the Persian actually. Okay? So someone who could, you can imagine this from the fact that you look at, a text, 15th century Sanskrit text that I have studied, has the Munshi, the Sanskrit equivalent of a Munshi, the scribe. He is writing down a transaction of a family of 4 being sold. So a Shudra is being sold for 10 rupees. A Shudri is being sold for 8 rupees. The child of the Shudra is being sold for 7 rupees. A smaller child, a young girl, is being sold for 5 rupees. And for writing down this transaction, the Pandit who's writing it is charging 2 rupees.
And that we should
So
continue.
you can imagine, and the term that it uses is rupekan. So rupe literally is silver. So 2 silver coins is what they are charging. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that a munshi was a high-flying man. Yet if you knew how to write, and if you also knew the technical vocabulary in which to write an affidavit or encode a transaction, then you were a highly paid man and you occupied very high echelons in the bureaus. The category of munshi, which is caricatured by actors like Jeevan in Indian films, actually is quite a sort of just that caricature. That kind of a munshi who is a usurer or who does all the dirty work for the Mahajan, I think that refers more to the 18th, early 19th century Zamindars family rather than pre-modern.
In fact, in the 20th century, Munshi is a very respectable name in the trading communities. I'm working now recently in Amritsar. The Munshi is the one who kept all the accounts of all the business people. Before the income tax people stopped the money, they were. The Munshi was very respectable. They live in the neighborhood.
It then also becomes a generic term to refer to anyone who worked in the office. For example, Munshi Premchand. That name stuck because he worked as a clerk for some time. Let's say Munshi Einstein. He also worked in
So yesterday, Professor Prabhupada Patra's lecture, he was talking about how servitude is deeply embedded in caste and religion, especially in the South Asian context. And when you were talking about the ideas of Naukri and Bandhi, you were also talking about the idea of willful submission and perfecting your loyalty towards your master and how it's constantly taking away from kinship to cultivate a more contractual form of servility. For spaces still outside the Mughal control, for instance in the Deccan, I was reading Parmanand's Shiv Bharat, and there the kind of relationship that Shivaji's family has is one of constantly negotiating loyalty and service to both the court of Ahmednagar and Bijapur. And these loyalties are shifting, negotiating. So again, very fluid kind of relations. Can we? But again, Shivaji's family is not able to assert control solely based on on their own identity. But it is only in relation to the courts of the Deccan sultans. So can this be roughly categorized into the relation or even the ideas around Naukri and Bandhi?
Well, दो तीन चीजें आपके one is where you started, Prabhu's comment about Naukri being which is very obvious. And I'll give you a couple of examples why that is always that should be kept in mind always. But the question of Shivaji, depending on which literary context you look at, if you're looking at Pankaj literature, it frames the whole issue slightly differently from the way the Mughal chronicles frame the issue. For the Mughal chroniclers, it was the issue of a man who cannot be trusted. Because for them, Shivaji is an asset, okay? But a very, very risky asset because he's a fighter, but he is difficult to control because he refuses to remain loyal. Okay? So he works for the Mughals and then shifts his loyalty, works for Ahmednagar, for Golconda,
goes back to the Mughals and so on. But in the Makar literature, all of this, because it is also retrospect, all of this is represented as an issue of his wealth and his family. So the issue of Naukari and Bandari does not come in the Makar. But so far as the Mughal chronicles are concerned, it is an issue of which Shivaji is not able to hold on to, which is reneging as far as the Mughal is concerned. Now, as for the caste thing, 3-4 things here are interesting. One, Shivaji emerged from the lower echelons of society. With Chandragupta Maurya and Sher Shah Suri, I think Shivaji should be considered among those who symbolize the sluice gate phenomenon, which is where even though the Varna hierarchy was important for kingship, they break through the Varna hierarchy and are able to get themselves coronated in spite of the fact that they inherit kingdom. Now, in each of the 3 cases, we see a different trajectory. In the case of Chandragupta Maurya, it takes the Brahmanic Sanskrit lecture about 1400 years to come to terms with it when Vishakhadat writes Mudra Rakshas and declares forever that it was Chanakya who made Chandragupta Maurya a ruler. So you have kind of set aside a historical character 1400 years later by asserting that actually it was a Brahman who did. So now you don't have to bother about explaining why Chandragupta Maurya could become a ruler, because an angry Brahman decided he will make ruler out of anyone that he wished. In the case of Sher Shah, because he is also a Muslim, it is very, very difficult. Okay? So you don't have the same issues of caste. But in the case of Shivaji, he has difficulty in real time in getting himself coronated. So he had to, no Brahman in Pune would agree to preside over his coronation. So he had to import a Pandit from Banaras. Right? So why? Because everyone knew Shivaji. आप invent नहीं कर सकते थे चीज़ें. People knew Shivaji. So in Pune, the Brahmanas would be put to shame. इसलिए उनको बनारस से मनाना. So to the caste embeddedness of service itself, including the idea of becoming the concept, is very important. Okay? Because after all, even later on in the Peshwa time, you notice that the Peshwas are ruling, but only indirectly. So the idea of the servant embedded within the caste structure is very important. मुझे याद है, and most of the early, for example, 1970s and 80s में जो quarters बनते थे या bungalows, उसमें there would be 2 entries, right? एक पीछे की entry होती थी, एक सामने की entry होती थी या side. और क्यों 2 entry होती थी? Because the toilet cleaner would come from the back, not cross the entire household, clean the toilet and go away. Okay? Doesn't have to interact with anyone. On the other hand, if the grocery provider comes, the person will be given a stool to sit, to catch his breath. If the domestic servant comes, she might spend hours together in the house, but would be made to sit on the ground. But if the Pandit comes, even if he is more poor than the others, the choices of crockery will be produced. This is what we have seen growing up in our own family. Even today in middle class households, you will notice that irrespective of the particular caste of the domestic servant, maid servant, pieces of utensils have been put aside for their use. So it's a caste mentality that persists, even though we may not bother to ask. We might find it distasteful to ask domestic servants which caste.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is not actually a question, but just a comment that came up from the discussion and something that might or might not be pertinent here. And of course, before that, being from Calcutta and Bengal, again, that image of the Jomadarer Dorja, the patronage Dorja for the washroom of the household, which is so common in the older households and still comes to our mind, even though it's gone out of fashion. So I was actually quite fascinated by the interaction between something that you mentioned right at the beginning, which was the concept of the household or the family in the Mughal context, and I'll get to that, and loyalty, which came up in this recent discussion about Shivaji, because it's interesting how if you look at the early and the middle of the 17th century and some separate occasions of succession struggles within the Mughal household, it's interesting how on the one hand you have the mention of Shivaji being this untrustworthy asset, which is a wonderful way of looking at it, because of course the Mughals are trying to woo him and use him as a very kind of powerful Mansabdar in the south, but he always wriggles out of control and then becomes an independent ruler. And part of that maybe is the fact that he is not coming from within the household, and so that even though he's part of the Sultanate world in the Deccan, but he has not been conditioned within the, let's say, tenets of loyalty within the Mughal household of the imperial north, which is of course Delhi and Agra and Lahore and so on. But on the other hand, if we look at the classic lineages of Rajput, Mansabdar / Rajas who've been there for multiple generations, I find it's quite interesting that even during times of succession, if they are not backing the eventual successor, the eventual victor in that war or in that struggle, they are not punished in the way that we might imagine them to be, but rather they are kind of brought back to service quite quickly. So, for instance, Raja Jai Singh and Jaswant Singh backed Dara in the War of Succession of 1657 and 59. But the moment Aurangzeb wins, both of them are given very handsome governorships and other postings. Or let's say Mirza Aziz Koka and Man Singh during the Khusro versus Salim struggle during Akbar's death. And maybe that great amount of tolerance is because of the fact that they are members of the household and have been so for a while, but also because their loyalty may shift between different members of the family or the household, but not or never beyond the household. So they're fighting for different representatives of the family for the throne, but they are still fighting for a Mughal prince within that bloodline to succeed. And therefore, even though they might not come up on the winning side, they are still kind of accommodated back into the fold quickly as if nothing had happened. So this just came to my mind. I don't know. This works.
I think these Farooqis were talks at length about these issues, where the most important thing is perhaps to realize that when the Rajputs, for example, chose sides, benevolence was extremely important. In fact, since you mentioned Jaswant Singh, I think it ties up very well with the Munshi concern, because one of Jaswant Singh's famous scribes was Nancy. And Nancy was imprisoned. He didn't get the same liberal treatment that Aurangzeb had for Jaswant Singh. Nancy was imprisoned, so much so that Nancy eventually committed suicide as a protest. Very few people know, even though I mean, it's pretty well known among people in Rajasthan that Nancy, a famous writer who couldn't stop writing and wrote so many books, is known as the Abul Fazl of Rajasthan, eventually committed suicide while being in prison, put in prison by Raja Jaswant Singh. And he was a munshi. He was a very high-ranking man within Rajput household, not household, but within the Rajput state. So, to that extent, I think it sort of ties up very well that there are these ideas of graded service. So, Naukri at various levels is, so if you are a cabinet or foreign secretary, then you may move on to become a minister sometimes in the future, but not so if you are
It's very interesting that you mentioned that particular strike because only yesterday Najaf Haider also spoke about another such very successful and upwardly mobile strike, Govardhan Suraj, was also targeted this time after yet another successful struggle, which was for Shah Jahan's coming to the throne in 1628, where again he's very personally targeted by Shah Jahan and his village is ravaged and he himself completely vanishes from the record. So again, that whole idea of a scribe not getting the same treatment. But thank you.
I would like to invite Devina to give it.
On behalf of the History Society, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Pankaj. We would like to present you with a token of our appreciation. I request Dr. Mahesh Gopalan to kindly present the memento to sir. We also thank everyone whose support allowed this event to happen. Finally, a big thank you to the audience who joined us today and made this event a success. We have the last day of Kaalchakra tomorrow with a movie screening and a play by Jan Natya Manch. Hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.